reading from Deuteronomy. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, or your son or daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your town, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Word of God, word of life.
Thanks be to God.
I'm going to interrupt here for a minute, because this is a great opportunity to take a look at this passage from Deuteronomy, which is the second recording in the Hebrew Scriptures of the Ten Commandments. And you'll recognize this is the one that I read Luther's Small Catechism on this morning. According to this reading from Deuteronomy, why do we keep the Sabbath? You didn't know you were going to be tested.
It's holy.
Because it's holy, but what is the situation in Israel's history that causes the Sabbath to be important? They came out of slavery. Thank you. Yes, they were enslaved in Egypt. And Sabbath became, now slaves don't get a day off. That's basically what the author of Deuteronomy is saying here. Moses is speaking in Deuteronomy. Slaves don't get a day off. Slaves work 7 days a week, not by choice, but by force. So we have a Sabbath day, a day to rest, so that we remember that we're not slaves, that we have freedom. Now, how valuable is that to us, that we're not slaves? That's an important part of our identity. That's an important part of our identity as Americans in particular, when we value the freedom that we have, but as people throughout the world to celebrate the fact that they're not slaves. They take a day off, they rest, they relax. How many of you sometimes when you're in church on Sunday morning think about the things you have to do later in the day? I know I do, right? And sometimes we don't allow ourselves even this half day, this hour and a half of rest, because we have other things that we're trying to get through. And then when the preacher goes a little bit too long, we know that he's cutting into those other things that we have to do. Sisters and brothers, we are not slaves. We are not slaves to someone else, nor are we slaves to our own schedule. We need time to rest. Now, of course, you can imagine that sleep has been studied by scientists in a number of ways. After about 8 days without sleep, your higher level functionings begin to suffer. You don't think straight. Your perception is off. There are lots of negative effects on your ability to be present to the world around you after 8 days. So after 6 days is probably a good time to stop, rest, recharge, renew yourself. Or as our prayer of the day says, that God uses the Sabbath day, He uses this time that we have together for worship to make whole, complete, refreshed, renewed everything that God has made. This is our opportunity. We don't want to squander it. This is our chance to feel that wholeness that God can bring back into our lives, to get renewal, because we're not slaves. We're God's people who can rejoice in this Sabbath. According to Exodus, there's a slightly different reason for keeping the Sabbath day, and I'll read that to you. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. So far this sounds exactly like Deuteronomy, right? But here's what Moses says in Exodus. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. So according to Exodus, why do we take a day off? Why do we observe the Sabbath? It's because even God needed a break, right? That's what Exodus is telling us. So if God needs a break, so do we. So from these two passages that explain the fourth commandment, there are two reasons to keep Sabbath, to rest, to spend time with God. Number one, you're not a slave. And number two, you're not God. Even God rested. So if God needed to rest, certainly we do too. And I was wondering if you guys had any fun Sabbath traditions that you remember growing up. I remember that the church that we attended as a family when I was a child was a block away from my grandparents' house. And on those really lucky Sundays, it wasn't every Sunday, but on those lucky Sundays, my parents would say to us after church, "We're going over to Granny and Poppy's for lunch." And that was really cool. We loved that follow-up to church because we were in church together and then we were going to go spend time with our grandparents. So that was a really nice tradition that we didn't have to study. We didn't have to go home and do work. We could just hang out with our grandparents and enjoy some good family time. Does anybody have any Sabbath traditions that they remember? Any Sunday traditions from your childhood? Or yes, Joan?
The candy store.
Candy store. A great way to observe the Sabbath. That's really neat. That must have been something you looked forward to. Cool. Anybody else? Beata.
We had, that was during the war, we had a nice meal on Sundays and we had pudding afterwards on Sundays, so we knew that was Sunday. And we went with a meal, a good meal.
A good meal and then
And
pudding.
then rest afterwards.
And then rest.
So we wouldn't do anything.
Even in wartime.
And even worse.
That's pretty wonderful. Nice, thanks. Rebecca.
Sunday dinner, my mother always invited somebody from church home for Sunday dinner.
Huh.
So we always had to come home straight from church, do 2 hours of unadulterated work to clean the house,
Whoops.
and then have company.
Huh. That's pretty neat.
Company Sunday dinner.
Sunday dinner. Nice, yeah. Food. Irene.
Listen to the radio, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock,
Really? As a family.
as a family.
Uh-huh. And just relax
And
together.
those are fun things.
Nice, nice. That's really great. Rick.
I just remember my mom still is a really good cook. And she would be preparing us. We would be getting ready to go to church, early church, and then Sunday school. She'd be preparing this big meal and getting it in the oven. But when we came home at about 11:30, the house smelled really wonderful. And it was this big lunch that we were going to have. It was a roast or it would be something. But it just like you walk in and you go, oh, this is really good.
Nice. Yeah. You're back again.
I mean, I can remember walking in and smelling it. It's like
Yeah.
it's still smelling.
Nice, thanks. So one of the things that occurs to me is that as life changes, and you and I both know, people work on Sundays now, it's fairly common, and we're not just talking about essential personnel, right? Construction workers, a lot of people work on Sundays, a lot more than I recall from my childhood, which was not that long ago. A lot of people work on Sundays, and we don't take time to rest. And I think we can lament the passing of those traditions, or we can bring them back as a way to observe the Sabbath in ways that are appropriate for our time. Being intentional about taking time to rest and to recharge and to give our bodies and our minds and our spirits an opportunity to just find themselves in a different pathway that can be energizing, so that when Monday rolls around, we're ready for a new week of whatever it is, work or retirement or volunteer work or caring for people, whatever that is, to take that Sabbath time and make sure that we observe the Sabbath, because, well, I'll save that thought for later. More in a minute, but Lee, I'll let you continue this.